Good morning, everybody. An NGO, which is called the ICJ, the International Commission of Jurists, has published a document calling for minors to be recognized as having the right and ability to give consent for intercourse. This goes against every norm and standard of child protection and child welfare that has been advanced and applied over the last century or century and a half. So they have published this document, and I'll read a little bit of it later. But the ICJ is an NGO, non-governmental organization, but it is very, very much tied in with the United Nations, although it's not a United Nations body itself. It does, however, have a leader, and at various points, the leaders of the ICJ have been in the past UN High Commissioners for Human Rights, and I think the current leader of the ICJ is also on the UN Human Rights Committee. It has been given an award by the United Nations in the field of human rights, and it was also awarded the Light of Truth Award by the Dalai Lama in 2013, who has recently been caught asking a young boy to suck his tongue. Now, the ICJ's document here, which is online, is entitled the 8th of March Principles for a Human Rights-Based Approach to Criminal Law, Prescribing Conduct Associated with Sex, Reproduction, Drug Use, HIV, Homelessness, and Poverty. And if you scroll down in the document, it lists a number of principles that they want to be adopted by nations around the world. And Principle 16 of the document is entitled Consensual Sexual Conduct. And I will just read this out in full so you can see the kind of thing it's saying. It says here, consensual sexual conduct, irrespective of the type of sexual activity, the sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression of the people involved, or their marital status, may not be criminalized in any circumstances. Consensual same-sex as well as consensual different-sex sexual relations or consensual sexual relations with or between trans, non-binary or other gender-diverse people or outside marriage, whether premarital or extramarital, may therefore never be criminalized. With respect to the enforcement of criminal law, any prescribed minimum age of consent to sex must be applied in a non-discriminatory manner. Enforcement may not be linked to the sex, gender of participants or age of consent to marriage. Now, here is the important bit, which is talking about the attitudes they have and what they want to be adopted in terms of minors, children, and the age of consent. It goes on to say here, moreover, sexual conduct involving persons below the domestically prescribed minimum age of consent to sex may be consensual, in fact, if not in law. In this context, the enforcement of criminal law should reflect the rights and capacity of persons under 18 years of age to make decisions about engaging in consensual sexual conduct and their right to be heard in matters concerning them. Pursuant to their evolving capacities and progressive autonomy, persons under the age of 18 years of age should participate in decisions affecting them with due regard to their age, maturity, and best interest, and with specific attention to non-discrimination guarantees. So essentially what this is saying is that children under the age of 18 can give consent. In fact, even if the law says they can't give consent. Well, actually they can't. They are not developed enough in their minds and their brains in order to give consent And that is the whole point of having an age of consent law. It is to protect children from predators. Now, the age of consent is different in different nations around the world, but most nations have an age of consent somewhere between 14 to 18. In the United Kingdom and most of the United States, it's 16, is in Russia as well. It's 15 in France. In China and Germany and Brazil, it's 14. Much lower. In India, it's 18, but it's generally around the world between 14 and 18 because that's considered the age at which a person growing up, a child, is able to make decisions for themselves in this area. But clearly, when someone is a child, they cannot make decisions and give informed consent to such activity because they cannot comprehend the ramifications of what they're doing through the rest of their life and into adulthood, which is why we have an age of consent. Now, my own country, the United Kingdom, is very interesting in terms of the historical context. Before the late 19th century, the age of consent was actually much lower. People don't really realize that. It was something between 10 and 12, depending on where who you were. But it was raised to 13 in 1875 by the Offences Against the Person Act. So that was to protect younger children. Then there was a very powerful expose by a journalist in London called William Thomas Stead, who wrote for the Pall Mall Gazette, exposing child exploitation in the London Underground, where many, many girls in their teenage years were being exploited, essentially groomed, and, without using explicit words, pimped out to customers and clientele in London. Not many people knew this was going on until this brave journalist, William Thomas Stead, exposed it in a number of articles called The Maiden Tribute. And this caused a public outcry and a call for children to be protected. So the age of consent in the UK was raised again in 1885 from 13 to 16 for the protection primarily of girls who were being exploited. So it was then considered they cannot give their consent. If anybody does anything with them or to them, they are guilty of a criminal offence, because why on earth would an adult want to do something with a child? It's not for the benefit of the child. It's at best for the self-gratification of the adult, and at worst, and of course, all the time, it is exploitation, and children need to be protected from this. So this call from this NGO, which is very, very linked in with the UN, and of course held in high acclaim by the establishment of the globalists around the world, is utterly deplorable, because it undermines and undercuts all of the child protection that nations have been putting in over many, many decades, and over a century in the case of the UK, in order to protect children. There is a move now in order to establish children's rights. So this is being done under the umbrella of human rights. Now, of course, there are human rights for everybody. I prefer to use the term fundamental freedoms. We have the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religious belief, freedom to bring up our children according to our own beliefs and traditions. These are our fundamental freedoms. But what is called human rights very often goes against fundamental freedoms and against common sense and against the best interests of a number of people or certain groups. And in this case, pushing for so-called children's rights actually hurts them and harms them because it undermines the protection of children. We have terrible problems in the UK with grooming gangs, which is known about all around the world. And all these people who are talking about children's rights and, well, protecting children were absolutely nowhere, because they actually came out, the people and the powers that be in the UK, and said, well, we're not going to do anything to protect children's welfare because in the case of victims of grooming gangs, they didn't want to be seen as racist. So child welfare went out of the window. But if this report or this advice comes in and is adopted, then what the perpetrators of these crimes could say is, well, they groomed underage people, underage minors, but they could say they did it in such a way that they gave their consent, and therefore this would no longer be a criminal offence. No, it is a criminal offence. It's just that the powers that be didn't do anything about it for many, many years and are still not doing enough about it, and have let the people exploiting children just get away with heinous, heinous crimes. But it also allows other people who are adults who want to engage in certain activities, which as we're talking about the subject, without being too explicit, I think you can certainly understand what I'm talking about, because there are many people who are non-CESs who would want to do this and easily exploit the idea of children's rights in order to justify their activities and proclivities, and then say, and this would give them a carte blanche, a free rein to just go and do what they wanted, and they could say, well, it was consensual and therefore the child will not be protected, and these non-CESs will not be criminal as they are today. And that is absolutely appalling. So this is what's going on. This is the next stage of the agenda, starting from the sexual revolution, the Western cultural revolution in the 1960s has gone on and on and on and on and on. We've had the transgenderism being brought in from 2015 onwards. Now we're here, 2022, 2023. They're bringing in the idea of children's rights, if you like. You can add a few words to that in your mind. And this needs to be called out and stopped before it ever takes hold.